it's both an honor and a privilege to join these distinguished speakers today. And I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to come to Yerevan and to join them and to share some of my own memories and thoughts. Your conference is really about the last 25 years and what that tells us about the future. My memories in this area go back much further than that. I visited Yerevan for the first time in the fall of 1961. And I recall I was traveling with an American senator, and we came and we stayed in a very large hotel right at the head of a grand avenue. And we could look down that avenue, and at the end of it, or within sight, was a huge statue of Joseph Stalin. The next morning we woke up and the statue wasn't there. It was during the Party Congress when Khrushchev made his public denunciations of Stalin, and the statues to Stalin changed overnight. We had actually flown from Moscow, stopping first in Stalingrad, but before that trip was over, the city was renamed Volgograd. So abrupt changes have occurred in the past. The last time I was privileged to be here in Yerevan was in November 1989. And I recall getting up the second morning I was here and asking the political officer from the embassy in Moscow who was traveling with me, well, what's the news today? And he said, you know, the wall in Berlin is opening up and people are crossing both ways and are beginning to tear it down. Another, I would say, not totally anticipated change in history. One of the things I want to think about is, as we look at the future, the fact that anyone who tries to straight line a recent development far into the future is apt to be wrong. There are simply too many things that happen along the way, too many things that are unanticipated, or sometimes the anticipated things don't turn out to have the significance we thought they might. So, in thinking about the future, I think we have to bear those things in mind. Now, one of the things that puzzles me in some respects about the last 25 years is how we have moved from what was in 1991, not just the year when the Soviet Union broke up, but also the year when suddenly we realized Europe, probably for the first time in human memory, Europe was whole and free. And yet today, we suddenly see all the, at least public earmarks, of a new Cold War. Can it really be? Well, of course, relations between Russia and Europe and the United States are now, I would say, mired in the sort of polemics that also marked the Cold War. And yet the conditions are quite different. After all, Russia is not the Soviet Union, and it is not a Marxist dictatorship with the Brezhnev doctrine of imposing its form of socialism on others and once imposed, keeping it there. So how is it that we have reached a situation that in many ways, particularly in propaganda, on both sides, sets us out as hostile nations? I think one of the causes, as I look back at it and have observed over this time, is that both sides really misunderstood how the Cold War ended. Was it truly a victory of the West brought about by greater military and economic support? Or did the Cold War end by negotiation that actually was in the interests of both parties? As a participant in those negotiations, I would say that the Cold War ended by negotiation. The Soviet Union was not defeated in the Cold War. As a matter of fact, ending the arms race and ending the hostility was a boon to all of the countries. And indeed, it was not brought about simply by Western pressure, but also by a recognition, beginning actually in the United States, that a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and therefore there can be no war between us, that is, between the two major nuclear powers. This was an agreement that President Reagan and then General Secretary Gorbachev made in their very first meeting in Geneva in 1985. And it was the basis on which we convinced both sides, when we came to understand this, that we were simply wasting our country's assets in competing and building these huge militaries, which could not rationally be used. You know, at one point there were actually something like 60,000 nuclear weapons, almost all of them in the hands of either the Soviet Union or the United States. It was hard to say how many times that quantity of weapons would have destroyed civilization. Some scientists said 7, others said no, 20. And then the question arises, well, once you've done it once, why would you want to do it again? And of course, the answer was nobody was planning to use those things. But we were in the sort of psychology that if the other side thought they had a slight edge, then they might do something to us. Therefore, you had to match them and, if possible, go a little ahead. Now, that nuclear arms race, we ended. However, I would say that today, although the number of nuclear weapons are much reduced, still over 90% are in the hands of the United States and Russia. And if ever all those weapons are used, civilization will not survive. And this is something that I think over the last 25 years has slipped out of the political consciousness and thinking of the rest of the world. In general, looking back at that period, I think that many of the changes internationally have occurred because on both sides of this confrontation or divide, there has been basic misunderstandings of how we ended the Cold War and what it meant. And in particular, how the breakup of the Soviet Union occurred. Too many people feel that the Cold War ended with the breakup of the Soviet Union. That's simply not true. It was over at least 2 years before the Soviet Union broke up. And the breakup of the Soviet Union was not, in any sense, a sign of the victory of the West, but rather of the tendencies within the Soviet Union that pushed it apart. Many of us, like Professor Sunni at the time, worried about the sudden breakup. Professor Sunni was not the only one who hoped that Gorbachev's reforms would be able to prevail in all or most of all except for the 3 Baltic countries, which obviously for many reasons were special and required the total independence. However, it didn't happen that way, not because of Western pressure, but because of internal events. So, in effect, by looking at the breakup of the Soviet Union as a victory of the West, and looking at the end of the Cold War as also a quasi-military victory, meant that you had in the West first the triumphalism of the end of history, sort of attitude that Professor Sunni has referred to. However, the fact is that the tensions that developed then between Russia and the United States and Europe were often the result, I think, of mistaken policies in the West and then an overreaction in the part of Russia. Now, what does all this mean now for a country like Armenia? First of all, let me say that I do not believe that there is any compelling reason for Russia and the United States, or for that matter, Russia and the European Union, to be enemies. I think that all of us have cultural traditions, and I certainly will not dispute any of Professor Sunni's characterization of present-day Russia. However, I would caution in looking at the future that the future within Russia is far from set. Obviously, there are many pressures pushing. I think that Russia and other countries are going to have to find their way as to what degree of what we would call democracy, of what sort of institutions work and which don't. Certainly, I think there are very few countries in the world, if any, that can consider themselves completely democratic. And I wonder about the United States, which now twice has inaugurated presidents who receive fewer votes than their opponents. One has to qualify these things very much. But I do think one thing is clear. Whatever the system in Russia evolves, whatever the system in Armenia evolves, however, is going to be the result in Russia of what the Russians will do, in Armenia of what you Armenians will do. So that I think that to think that there is some universal pattern that has to be conformed to is something that I would question. Now, the international environment is currently obviously extremely complicated. We'll have time to talk about a number of the local issues, which I know are extremely important. But I think it is also time for us to begin to think about some of the broader issues. What are the principal threats facing us today? As far as I know, the only threat that is truly existential for a country like the United States, or for that matter, Russia, is related to nuclear weapons. If these weapons are ever used, then civilization will not survive, and there is no way to make sure if somebody starts using them that would be the end of it. Now, I think this is one of the issues that we tend to have forgotten and we need to get back to. And that's one of the reasons that I had some hope, though I did not support him for president, that when President Trump during his campaign kept saying it's better to cooperate with Russia than not, I would have to agree. I think we need to find a way to get back to cooperation on the nuclear issue. And second, in the longer term, again, a potential existential issue for all of us is that of global warming and general environmental degradation. That, plus the other major problems we face, terrorism, failed states, none of these can be solved by military action. They all have to be solved by cooperation. And I think that we must find our way back to a framework where we can cooperate over those issues. And I think that is a task also for the future, for particularly countries like Armenia, which are caught up in the bigger issue, but also can take the leadership in trying to develop new methods of cooperation, whether they be regional or not. That's going to take an effort to, I would say, to end the parochial views of history, views that tend to revive old problems and ways to deal with them without violence. Let's hope that that will happen. And in particular, I look forward to the discussion we'll have of many of the issues here. Armenia is important not only for Armenians, but also as an example for the rest of the world in solving problems that are common to all of us. And thank you for the possibility of participating today.